Welcome everyone to Deschutes Public Library's online programming. I'm Liz Goodrich, and you are here today for a program, part of a series we've been doing all this year in celebration of the Deschutes Public Library's 100-year anniversary. The series is called Deschutes by the Decade, and we've invited our friends from the Deschutes County Historical Museum to stop by once a month and give us a look into what Deschutes County looked like through these 100 years. So today we're going to be talking about the 70s, which doesn't feel that long ago and also feels very long ago. And I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Kelly Cannon Miller is the Executive Director for the Deschutes County Historical Society, which operates the Deschutes Historical Museum in downtown Bend. She's a graduate of Portland State University with a master's in history. She currently serves on the editorial board of the Oregon Encyclopedia and is a member of the Deschutes Cultural Coalition and writes for both the Oregon Encyclopedia and the Oregon Historical Quarterly. She is the daughter of an archaeologist and spent parts of her childhood in the deserts of southeastern Oregon, cataloging rock art and in the back rooms of regional universities and museums. Please welcome Kelly Cannon Miller.
Thanks, Liz. We will try to get my screen up. You are absolutely right that the 1970s feels both close and far away. I was born in 1970, so it was a lot of fun putting this together. Lots of flashback moments to childhood. So maybe that might be true for some of you as well. Let's see if I can hide myself and put just the screen up. There we go. Okay, Deschutes by the Decades, 1970s. First thing I want to say is this has been a lot of fun working with the library, putting these decade pieces together. I do not intend each of these 10-year slices to be the be-all, end-all of everything that happened during the 1970s or whatever decade we are in. And in fact, we're close enough now that a lot of you probably have memories of the 70s here in Deschutes County yourself. And I want to remind everyone that our collection here at the Historical Society, the photographs and archives and objects that we have here that we curate, all come from the community and from their donations. So if, as we're going through this, you think about photographs that you have of downtown Bend, Redmond, Sisters, Lapine, Terrebonne, anywhere out in Deschutes County, or events that have happened, buildings that came and went, and think that we might be interested in them, please feel free to give us a call or email us. You can find all of our information at deschuteshistory.org on our website, and we would love to hear from you and help us develop our collection, because as we get closer to the present, our collection is not as strong, and part of that is just because it hasn't occurred to folks that something is already considered history. Makes them feel a little bit old sometimes, like myself. So there's my plug for help us build our collection. So what was happening in Deschutes County in the 1970s? Let's start with the basics. The population in 1970 for the entire county is 30,000, just a little over 30,000 people. Bend is only at 13,700. Redmond is eking up there at 3,700, and Sisters is actually sadly still losing population and is ranking in at 516 folks in 1970. Nationwide, where are we in the bigger picture of things? In April 30 of 1972, we have the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War and the US involvement, a war that touched our community just as well as the rest of the country. So the beginning of the 70s sees the end of that troublesome war. It is the decade of gas prices and gas wars and gas shortages as prices go higher and higher there on the left. And it's also the decade of fuel efficient smaller cars like Datsun, which is going to become Nissan, which you can pick one up at Jim Smolich Motors there on the right. And it's going to be the decade that has Watergate and the fall of the Nixon presidency. Interestingly, the initial break-in doesn't even make the Bulletin newspaper in June of 1972. On the left there is the first time it shows up in the local paper with the Democratic Party filing suit against Nixon's committee. And then as 1972 progresses, the Bulletin starts to pick up more and more, and the name Watergate starts to stick as the name of the crisis that is seizing the presidency at that point in time. So that's the big picture of what's going on in the country. And here's the most important thing that happens in all of the 1970s in Deschutes County, and that is the formation of, drumroll please, the Deschutes County Historical Society. The Deschutes Historical Museum is born from this event in 1975, and it was actually sponsored by the American Association of University of Women, Bend chapter, that had selected the formation of a county-wide historical society among the things they wanted to complete for their bicentennial projects. Of course, 1976 is going to be the bicentennial of the country, and it's actually pretty common across the states to find historical societies being formed in 1975 and 1976 in response to this nationwide feeling of euphoria and interest in the history of the country. And we were among those to be formed. So it's our birthday year. We are 40 years old this year. Again, so here we go. July 5th, 1976, spirit of national unity emerges during star-spangled celebrations across the country. There's all kinds of bicentennial events going on. You see there on the left a full-page ad from Brooks Scanlon Mill celebrating the birth of the country. And on the right, we have actually the day after photograph from the fireworks in Drake Park. So for decades, 4th of July was celebrated in Drake Park, where fireworks were set off there. It was most of those years, it was done in conjunction with Bend's water pageant, which was held between the 1930s and the 1960s, which we talked about in last month's program. But the thing that interests me the most about that photograph from the newspaper the day after on July 5th is the condition of Drake Park. The headline, or above the headline, it talks about the two folks that you can see are conducting an early morning bottle search in Drake Park, picking up bottles to take back for the deposit. So as you can see, there is a ton of trash. And part of why the water pageant had ended in '65 was that residents were tired of Drake Park being trashed, particularly not just by the community, but by all the tourists who came to town for 4th of July. So it's no surprise looking at that picture that then the next year, 4th of July, 1977, that is the year that we start firing the fireworks off from Pilot Butte and starting the new tradition that we know and love today, which I'm sure the visibility is much stronger having them off of the Butte, but I know that a lot of our members have fond memories of sitting down in Drake Park and watching the explosions over Muir Pond. But if you ever wondered, that's when we started firing the fireworks off of Pilot Butte. Nearby us, the library is continuing to grow, and in the 70s, they're gonna add on to the library because the whole county just continues to grow and the demands of the library are greater. So our friends at the library are going to expand during the 70s as well. But let's talk about the thing that everybody talks about in the 70s, at least in our membership, and that is the filming of Rooster Cogburn and the Lady, which starred John Wayne, and we're missing a poster here on this slide, and Katharine Hepburn. So it was the sequel to True Grit. They were here in October of 1974 filming. Both stars stayed at Sunriver. This is a front page picture of Governor Tom McCall, who was from Central Oregon, visiting with Kate on set. And he also visited with John Wayne, the Duke. So I thought this headline was quite funny. Hi, it's Gov. Tom meets Duke and Kate. And part of developing this talk for the 70s made me feel like everything old is new again. So over the next several slides, there's a couple urban legends that I'll share, but most of it is going to feel eerily familiar. The new saying among historians isn't that history repeats itself, it rhymes, and going through the 70s very much feels that way as we deal with growth pressure and housing and who can afford housing. And then this was my favorite line that made me laugh in this article from John Wayne meeting Tom McCall. You can see down there towards the bottom that John Wayne, who was a famous Republican, saying the damn liberals are taking over the Senate, and wishing that Tom McCall and Ronald Reagan weren't leaving office quite yet. So everything old is new again. Other movies that were filmed around Deschutes County during the 70s included the television show How the West Was Won, James Arness and Eva Marie Saint. On the left is a full-page spread of locals who were having a grand time being extras and enjoying watching James Arness from afar. James Arness was like 6'6" and kind of an imposing guy, and he had been on Gunsmoke for a million years on television. So the town was just as enamored with him as they had been with John Wayne a few years earlier. But here's one that sadly has not survived the test of time and storytelling. In August of 1975, there was a film, Expedition for Sasquatch, filmed here. I just can't believe that no one remembers this to be sharing. Remember the time they filmed a movie about Sasquatch here? Have no idea if this movie exists on DVD or streaming or anything like that, but I challenge you all to find it. And the other great laugh about this piece from 1975 is, so the previous screen was on page 1, and then here on page 3, we have the famous Phil Brogan, who wrote for the Bulletin for his career, writing about Sasquatch, and that old timers tell of him leaving a footprint in the lava around Lava Butte, like actually a footprint where the lava squeezed up between his toes, which I think that they were all having a really good time teasing the people who were making the movie. As it gets to the end of this article, it refers to Joe Knowles or No Joels, and that a local Bend group promoted the area and the volcanic history. And that's a reference actually to the Bend Emblem Club, who famously liked to play pranks on people. And Dutch Stover would dress up as Noel Joels when they would bring groups of businessmen to town and pretend that he was this man that had been living on the land and wore a sagebrush skirt. So while this looks like a totally legit newspaper article, I'm pretty sure that Phil Brogan and the remnants of the Emblem Club were having a laugh at the Expedition Sasquatch filmmakers' expense. And the 70s are giving us that slow rundown of the logging industry as well. On the left, we see that Brooks Scanlon is closing their plywood plant in Redmond and shuffling employees around, hoping to minimize the number of staff layoffs that they can. On the right, Prineville is gloomy about the future as mills are having to close down. And the simple fact that the amount of lumber available continues to shrink and shrink and shrink. And as we're headed towards the end of the logging industry in Deschutes County. Some pretty famous crimes happen in the 1970s as well. One of them is the Klein Falls axe attack. Terry Jentz and Avra Goldman were two college students from Yale who in the summer of '77 had done a Trans-America bike ride and ended at Astoria. And they decided that they wanted to see more of Oregon and came down into Central Oregon on their bikes, stopped at Klein Falls State Park and set up their tent. And unfortunately, they were attacked during the night. A man first ran over their tent with his truck. So he drove over them first, then got out of the cab and attacked them with an axe. Miraculously, both of them lived. Terry Jentz was able to get herself to the highway and flag down some folks that helped them and helped get them to the hospital, to St. Charles here in Bend, and save their lives. And later, here's some reading recommendations for you. Terry actually came back to Central Oregon about 10 years ago and wrote a book about the experience and what it was like as an adult to deal with that experience and have the person who committed the attack never be caught and prosecuted. However, they do think they know who did attack them, as that person tended to go around town saying he had attacked them. So it's a fascinating read if you want to do a little true crime of Deschutes County. The other disappearance that happens in 78, actually the day before Christmas in 1978, Kay Turner was staying from Eugene, was staying in the Camp Sherman area, went out for a jog and disappeared that morning and was never seen alive again. Her body is not discovered until August of that year, and it ends up being that the man who came in and said, "Oh, I think I found that missing runner," was actually the person who killed her. But it took many, 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 many years for them to figure that out and be able to actually prosecute him for the murder and find out along the way that she was not his only victim. And last year, the Oregonian did a great online piece about that called Ghosts of Highway 20. I don't know if you can grab that link there on the screen, or you can just Google Ghosts of Highway 20 Oregonian. And I do say, I have to put the disclaimer in that it does not hold back on details, and so it's quite violent. But if you are interested in true crime and what happened to Kay Turner and others, I would highly recommend that piece. The Oregonian recently won an award for their reporting on it, so I recommend that for you. And then the poor case of Mary Jo Templeton. This is probably our most famous cold case in Deschutes County. Very grisly. Also in the spring of 1979, so not very long after Kay Turner went missing, Mary Jo Templeton went missing. And you can see there on the right that their first thought when they found human body parts in Muir Pond was that this must be Kay Turner, but it ended up being a different person, which kind of, just then escalated the fear factor for what was going on in this quiet rural part of Oregon. Recently, a podcast was done by Tim Underwood of Bend, trying to revive the cold case. The city of Bend has never stopped working on this case, but they're always just still in need of new leads, and hoping that one day that the mystery of Mary Jo will be solved. So there's some reading and podcast suggestions for you. Okay, urban legends. Were there adult film theaters in the area? And the answer is yes, there was actually 2. So there's a little building at Deschutes Junction. I believe it is still painted bright pink at this point. And for a period of time in the 1970s, it was an adult theater and shop, and often the target of some well-deserved picketing out front. But also downtown next door to the Bend Tower was the Fine Arts Theater, which, fine arts, okay, played some of the more risque end of movies that were being produced during the 1970s. So there's some more risque Deschutes County history for you. And this fine fellow is Bill Van Allen. Bill Van Allen was a photographer around Deschutes County for decades, wrote a couple of books, one on the bobcat that might be lurking around your bookshelves at home for longtime Bend residents. And shifting gears here to what Deschutes County looked like in the 70s. In our collection, Bill went up during the early 70s, between 1971 and 1970, let's say 4 is probably the last one. He went up in an airplane and took many, many aerial photographs of Deschutes County that are super useful to us today. They're not awesome graphic, photographs that you would have blown up and hanging on your wall, but for us, they give us a lot of information and a lot of data. And so here is the east side of Bend, just east of Pilot Butte, around 1971. And you are looking in the middle there. I apologize that my cursor is not working, so I can't point at it. But in the middle, in that whitish area that already has some roads snaking through it, that is the future home of St. Charles Hospital. And then up at the very top of the picture, you'll see some lined areas. That very top bit is Bend Pine Nursery, where the dog park is today, and Ponderosa Elementary. And the road that's cutting through on the right is not called 27th yet. It's called Denser Road. And in between there, between Bend Pine Nursery and up Denser Road a little ways, is where Mountain View High School is going to be built in about 8 years. So the east side of Bend was still open. It was still ranching and homestead plots. There's a shot of it today taken from Google Earth. You can see the St. Charles complex. You can see Mountain View High School and the track field there, and Bend Pine Nursery up at the top, and 27th running along the right. So very, very, very different. Here is over on the west side of another build picture. The space there in the middle is where Bend Athletic Club is going to be built. And off to the right, the row of buildings is the very first part of Mount Bachelor Village to be constructed, which also happens in the 1970s. Here you'll see Franklin on your left and Greenwood on your right. You're looking towards downtown. This is also around 1972. And the thing to note is how open still and residential at the bottom of the picture as you move towards 2nd and 3rd Street. We're still residential, even though the highway bypasses come through in the 60s. Not a lot of construction has gone on there. And this is 3rd and Greenwood. And one of the things to point out in this one is you can see in the upper left-hand corner of the photograph, the railroad depot buildings. So the freight depot is the long building that is there, and that is where Miller Lumber is today. Behind Miller Lumber, actually Miller Lumber is right in front of it, and then the railroad depot that is going to be moved and become Art Station is visible on the other side of it, and you can actually see a train coming into town. And this is a shot of downtown, and unfortunately right where it is torn is what I wanted you all to see, but that's where St. Charles Hospital was. That was Hospital Hill, so that's Lava and Franklin, and you can just see the spires of St. Francis Catholic Church in the very bottom of the picture. So there was downtown in the early 1970s, and that's where the hospital is when we start the decade. And here's where we get into that. Oh boy, this feels awfully familiar. In the early 1970s and 72, the first Forest Service guidelines restricting campground use have to be put down because so many people are coming to stay. So the editorial column on the left is talking about how they are restricting campground days to a limit of 7 days, although some more remote ones you can stay as many as 10 days. So where we're talking about permitting today, the first go round of this was actually reducing the number of days that people could stay. And on the right, we see an article about how nobody's happy about this campground fuss. What do you mean they have to restrict how long we can stay there? It would be just so much easier if people visited but didn't stay. And we started to talk about this in the 1960s program, that the very end of the 60s and into the beginning of the 70s is when we get a major shift in Deschutes County. We start to see the development of resorts. And this is where we're going to transition from being a logging community and agricultural community to a resort and tourism-based destination. So Sunriver is getting going up the highway in Jefferson County. Canita is started in 1971, and by 1976, they're expanding. And Black Butte Ranch gets started near Sisters. And Black Butte Ranch is an offshoot of Brooks Resources Corporation. And Brooks Resources gets started in 1969 as a part of Brooks Scanlon Company. And this is where the company that sees that at the end of logging is coming for them has started to diversify and has reached out into the development business by forming Brooks Resources. And for the 1970s, they will remain a part of Brooks Scanlon. Their major development projects will be Black Butte Ranch, but also Mount Bachelor Village. And by 1979, just ahead of Brooks Scanlon Mill selling to Diamond International, Brooks Resources will break away from their parent company and become their own company. And this is a really important part of 1970s history for Deschutes County, because Brooks Resources has remained under the guidance of the magnificent Mike Holloran, who is an incredible benefactor for arts and culture in our area. Brooks Resources will be a leader in how Deschutes County develops throughout the 80s, 90s, even to the present day with their current projects. So remember good old Tom McCall, our governor, who grew up under the rimrock of Central Oregon and graduated from Redmond High School. One of the landmarks of his governorship was his signing into law Oregon's land use planning laws. This happens, it starts in 1969, but the 1973 version that is passed really finalized the program that we have today with your urban growth boundaries, the fact that all counties around the state needed to do land use planning and zoning and come up with comprehensive plans for their area, and cities needed to respond to that as well. And it's really important that McCall's youth on ranches and in agriculture really helped inform this process. And while a lot of people struggle with the land use system today, it really is born from farmers and ranchers who are trying to protect their livelihood and their farmlands. And that was the main impetus that McCall had as well. And the environment was very, very important to him. And speaking in front of the legislature in January of 1973, pushing the signing of this bill, McCall said, "There is a shameless threat to our environment and to the whole quality of life, the unfettered despoiling of the land, sagebrush subdivisions, coastal condomania, and the ravenous rampage of suburbia in the Willamette Valley all threaten to mock Oregon's status as the environmental model for the nation. We are in dire need of a state land use policy, new subdivision laws, and new standards for planning and zoning by cities and counties. The interest of Oregon for today and in the future must be protected from the grasping wastrels of the land." So that was the impetus behind the land use planning that happened in the 1970s. If you're interested in knowing where their influence came from, it was mainly from a book called The Quiet Revolution in Land Use Control by Fred Bozelman and David Calais that came out in 1972. That was their main guide for creating Oregon's land use policies. And those would immediately, come into play as Deschutes County continued to develop. So here we see in the 1976, we get the Deschutes County Preliminary Comprehensive Plan published in the bulletin for everyone to review and see the goals and policies for how the county would move forward with planning. And at this point in the 1970s, agriculture and timber management are still very top heavy in our economic plan. So the difference between agricultural land and resort properties is still pretty real and going to be pretty raw throughout the 1970s. And the other piece of all of this is this, I often laugh about Deschutes County people being obsessed with roads and who's paying for the roads and how can we get better roads. The thing that drew everyone's attention and ire throughout the 70s, if you go through the newspapers for all of Deschutes County, were sewer upgrades. I know it's really sexy history, right? But it's what was happening in the 1970s, that they were fighting and fighting and fighting about sewers. And we've actually seen this still in South County over the last few years with the La Pine area. And, you know, what is the county, you know, going to make them do for putting in sewers? Well, this all dates back to the 70s. And do we need this costly sewer and the replacement of septic tanks? Zoning changes, all of that just becomes, you know, batted around very, very emotionally and fervently as people are trying to do development projects. How do we grow? How do we be a grown-up city? But this one just made me laugh really hard. For Sewergate, beware, beware, borrowing heavily from Alice in Wonderland there. Make sure you get your answers before and not after from the county and what they're going to make you do on your property. So that's what had everybody in a twist during the 1970s was sewer. But we're growing and we need to put them in. Here's an example. This is Ward construction. A lot of you would be familiar with Nottingham Square. All of these planned communities start happening in the 1970s and will only keep growing into the future. And this also is one of those everything old is new again headlines that we often find when we're going through the paper, that in the 70s home buyers were startled that it was difficult to find a house costing under $40,000 in the market, which the cost of living then, $40,000, was out of reach for a lot of folks. So a lot of the same things are plaguing us in the 70s. They're plaguing us today. Oh, there we get to go through Sewergate again. But we are starting into suburbia. And so here's a giant E for Emporium. And some of you may or may not remember Mountain View Mall. Today it's Cascade Village Shopping Center, but 1979 is going to bring Bend its biggest to date indoor mall. Mountain View Mall had Kmart, it had Emporium. One of the big ringers that they scored was a G.I. Joe, which was an Pacific Northwest owned outdoor store for decades around the area. And this was the furthest south, I think, that G.I. Joes came. They were very well known in the Portland and Willamette Valley area. So 1979 brings us the indoor mall for cruising. And also in land use planning, in 1978 is when the City of Sisters adopted their ordinance, trying to be appealing to a sense of place and tourism, that all storefronts would be built in a Western wooden storefront style, so that while you do have some very historic buildings along Main Street in Sisters, new buildings would be built with storefronts to look and feel the part of the Western town as well. So different ways that land use planning come to bear. Here is the great ghost of the 1970s, however. This is the Pilot Butte Inn. So way back in 1917 is when the Pilot Butte Inn opened. It was the place for everything that was anything in Deschutes County. Wedding receptions, meetings. They had a magnificent spot along the river. So that would be the Newport Bridge coming in. And this is the full version of the Pilot Butte Inn. It was added onto as it expanded. So that you see the full L and their landscaped grounds behind them on the edge of downtown. Eleanor Roosevelt stayed there. Here's an early days shot from the dining room that had a plate glass window that overlooked the river. Here's a shot of the landscaped grounds behind, the stonework on one end, the crew. This was your classic Alpine Lodge, but by the 70s, it had fallen into disrepair. Here's a later shot of the background, one of the few we have in color. And sadly, because it dated from 1917, it didn't have a fire suppression system in it. And that was the biggie. That was the big ticket item that was going to cost a lot of money. It sold 2 or 3 times in the late 60s and early 70s. The citizens of Bend rallied to put it on the National Register of Historic Places in 1972, hoping to save it. A committee of concerned citizens brought in a student from the University of Oregon Historic Architecture program and tried to develop several scenarios where the property could be rehabilitated and brought up to a 70s standard to keep it going. But in the end, no one wanted to pay the big ticket price for remodeling and rehabbing and getting that fire suppression system in. And so in 1973, here came the wrecking ball. And we often have members talk about, oh, I stood on the sidewalk and cried watching it come down. And this is one of those moments where I often tell people that if they had had a crystal ball, they would have found the money because by the end, in its full heyday, there were a little over 200 rooms. So if you price it out at what the Oxford goes per night and times that by 200 rooms, you'd get an idea of how much it could be renting for if it was still in downtown Bend on the edge of the river today. But in the 70s, as the economy is declining for logging and tourism isn't quite what it's going to become, no one could see what its options were for the future. And down it came. But as often happens when you lose something like that that's so painful for a community, you end up saving other things. And so because the Pilot Butte Inn came down, its ghost is risen for many, many, many other buildings that get saved. So the Boys and Girls Club today is the Bend Amateur Athletic Club. When it was in disrepair, the community rallied around it and said, this won't be another Pilot Butte Inn, and saved it. The Rademacher House on the edge of Drake Park, that is still in use today, gets saved because it won't be another Pilot Butte Inn. And in Redmond, the new Redmond Hotel in '78 is bought up by someone who promises to restore it to its 1920s splendor. And again, it's not going to be another Pilot Butte Inn. So while the Pilot Butte Inn was a painful loss, it meant that many other buildings were saved. So here's a side shot of St. Charles Hospital on Hospital Hill on the edge of downtown before they move out to east of town. Everyone was just a Twitter that they would possibly die before they got so far out to the east side of town to a hospital. And why would you build a hospital so far out of town? In '78, the building is torn down. It's a combination of torn and burned, as you can see from this newspaper article, to be repurposed, and that's where the Doubletree Inn is today. And there's Sister Catherine in the newspaper in 1974. So Sister Catherine was the head of St. Charles Hospital, and it was her foresight that saw the land opportunities east of town and the need for expansion. She knew that even though they had recently expanded in 1970, the hospital downtown, it wasn't going to be enough, and it wasn't ever going to be enough land downtown for the hospital to expand. And so it was her leadership that brought St. Charles out east of town. And it took 5 years almost to complete the initial building. And here we see it in various stages of construction, and with sagebrush and juniper trees still around it until October 13th, 1975. St. Charles Center is formally dedicated in ceremonies. And the newspaper had an entire insert filled with ads, all congratulating the Sisters of St. Joseph, who were the order who ran St. Charles at that point. You can see all of their names there to the left, documenting 50 years worth of history, because it had been 1925 that they had built their first brick version of St. Charles on Hospital Hill. And so this was a huge leap forward into the future for St. Charles, and it was all under Sister Catherine's leadership. Also east of town, Mountain View High School home of the Cougars, as their voicemail says, as I've graduated now 2 children from Mountain View High School. The development of Mountain View High School in 1977 actually created an incredible rift through the community in a way that fans of TV show Friday Night Lights or the movie Friday Night Lights will appreciate. Here we see the front page of the first year of the annuals for Mountain View High School. You'll see it's Denser Road, not 27. It was barely finished in time for the first school year. You can see from the newspaper that kids had to unpack the chairs from boxes themselves, and it was quite chaotic the first couple of months. But here's the split, everyone. High school football was incredibly important to Deschutes County. All sporting events were important to Deschutes County, really, from throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s. And the rivalries between Bend and Redmond and Bend and Prineville and Redmond and Prineville and Prineville and Redmond were very, very, very strong. And there was a long, long, long tradition of the 3 communities playing sports for adult teams and high school teams, and long-standing rivalries and stories that I'm sure you can still find old timers to tell you today. But the development of Mountain View High School suddenly put a split in that. It was no longer Bend versus Redmond for the Civil War and who would win the Civil War title. It's now shifted to the 2 Bend high schools of Bend and Mountain View. And most importantly, it split the 2 star quarterbacks, Sean Corrigan and Bob Ellis, for that first year, and who would reign supreme. And I, I am not kidding that this was really, really important, that which school the boundaries were drawn around meant which football players went where, of course. And so there are stories from town of families renting apartments so that their son would still be with one school or the other for their football year. Friends to rivals, full page coverage of how Sean and Bob were going to handle the split. And that's a very strong Civil War rivalry to this day, even though we now have additional high schools with Summit, and Redmond has a couple of high schools. I know I just watched the Mountain View graduation for this year, and one of the first things the valedictorian said was that for the last 4 years, Mountain View had beat both Bend and Summit. So longstanding football rivalries survive to this day, but in the 1970s, they were particularly fraught. Okay. Further developments, the first multiplex theater opens on the edge of town. So again, we have that spreading out of suburbia starting to happen, things coming out of downtowns and onto the outer edges. And so we get luxury theaters on 3rd Street. The building is still there today. Kelly D's Sports Pub is in there. It's down near Chan's Chinese restaurant and the Porsche dealer. And because I'm a huge Star Wars geek, this is totally selfishly putting this in here, that the opening night of the theater was in the summer of 1977, 3 weeks after it had premiered. Star Wars premiered in Bend at the brand new multiplex. And there's the coverage of the line for Star Wars as they queued up for the brand new multiplex cinema in town to see the big blockbuster of the summer. So as we're changing from a from a logging community to more of a tourist destination, and more people are finding their way here, and things like the Potato Festival are on the way out, and we've already lost Ben's water pageant, we start to get some new festivals that are still with us today in the 1970s. So here we have some newspaper coverage of the very first Sunriver Music Festival, which is formed in 1978. Let's see, Polly and Doug Cahill, hopefully I'm pronouncing their last name right, were residents of Sunriver in 1978, and their friend Ray Fabrizio, who was one of the nation's most renowned flautists, was visiting them, and they were touring the Great Hall, left over from Camp Abbott, which is a beautiful building. If you've been in it, you know. And they stood in there and thought, wouldn't this be a great place to host a music festival? And lo and behold, they went for it. And the Sunriver Music Festival was born in 1978 and is still going strong this year in spite of COVID. And there we see their program from 1979. And here we have the 1970, this is actually 78, but in 1975, Gene Wells and Kathy Howells. Gene Wells owns the Stitch and Post quilt shop in Sisters, and in 1975 they hung 12 quilts outside for a display on the second weekend of July, and the Sisters Outdoor Quilt Show was born. Here you see the 1978 events listing in the Bend Bulletin under miscellaneous, and down towards the bottom you'll simply see quilt sale and show, downtown Sisters. So here are the humble beginnings for what is today the largest international outdoor quilt show in the world. They get thousands of people and 1,200 quilts. It's grown far beyond the 12 original quilts of the 1970s. And same thing, we get Pole Pedal Paddle. I really like this page. So this is Pole Pedal Paddle in 1981, excuse me. I like how it's not polished. It's not the polished major event that we have today with a canoe dumping over in the river. But Pole Pedal Paddle, as you all know, has grown to be one of our largest and favoritist festivals in Deschutes County. Also has its humble origins in the 1970s. And actually, if you go to YouTube, there's a video of one of the original founders from 2014. There was a show called My Window, Central Oregon, and a lot of their old interviews are on YouTube. So Jenny and Dave Sheldon had moved to Bend in 1975 from Jackson, Wyoming. And something similar to Pole Pedal Paddle existed in Wyoming. But when they got to Bend and got settled and started getting a feel for the community and for Mount Bachelor and the river and the skiing community with the Skyliners, they just knew that Pole Pedal Paddle would take off here as well. And they were not wrong. Jenny Sheldon, unfortunately, has been lost to breast cancer. But if you go to YouTube and look up My Window, Central Oregon, you can actually see an interview with her about how she scrapped together the first few Pole Pedal Paddles in the 1970s. It debuted in 1976. And there's also a recent interview featuring their daughter on Central Oregon Daily that you can look for as well. And so by the time we reach the 1980s, the county has grown quite a lot. This is the start of that transition from logging to recreation and tourism. We've grown to 62,000, but that's spread out throughout the county. It's not just in Bend. We get 17,000 in Bend, 6,000 in Redmond, and Sisters is back on the plus side and going up with 696 people. So that is Bend in the 1970s, a little bit rough and tumble, a little bit of naughty stuff. And I'll see if I can switch us back to Liz. Share.
There you go.
Hi, Liz.
Hi. So that was so much fun, Kelly, because my family moved to Bend in 1978. And so all of that, the town growing to the east, all of the shenanigans with Mountain View and Bend High. My dad participated in the early Pole Pedal Paddles. And, we moved from California. So we were not people were not super excited
to see you. You were among those coming in. Yes.
Correct. Yeah, my dad took a job coaching basketball at COCC, and to see what those planners, the people who were planning how Bend was going to grow at that time, we're making really interesting decisions about where they put things. And it's not by accident. There's some really interesting planning that happened.
Yeah, it's the super nerdy part of history, right? That why is this way? Why does this road go this way?
Yeah, why?
Yeah, that's when a lot of that was getting getting decided and mapped out, and the, you know, you have the visionaries like Sister Catherine, you know, who really saw where this all needed to go. And this
Right.
is the time period, you're right, with Californians, this is when Governor McCall got in hot water for saying, you know, please visit but don't stay. Well, you know, that's how it was at that point in time in Oregon.
Okay, so we're back. And for you very perceptive viewers, probably recognize that Kelly and I have different clothes on and we are indeed swapped sides. We had a little technical difficulty at the end of the program yesterday. So I invited Kelly to come back just for a quick couple of questions, just to sort of wrap up our program in a normal fashion rather than an internet problem.
Rather than
So,
frozen faces.
frozen faces. So Kelly, when we ended our recording yesterday, we were talking a little bit about the late, the 70s when there was an influx of folks from California moving into Oregon, and that the governor at the time, Tom McCall, had some sort of controversial or um, some feelings about that. And I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about Governor McCall's campaign.
Yeah, boy. Governor McCall really stirred the pot by saying that people were welcome to visit, but please don't stay. And, you know, over the years, that's been kicked around a bunch, as Oregon has experienced, you know, places like Deschutes County. Wow, he was ahead of the game before our real big population explosion. And it was largely folks moving from other areas. It was a lot of people who had retired, you know, and it's humans aren't great at change, generally speaking. And so to have your population boom and things change so dramatically, a lot of people in our county reference back to Tom McCall all the time of visit but don't stay. We want you to come spend your tourist dollars, but don't move here. I think that the Bend sucks, don't move here bumper stickers there's probably a direct line in lineage to Governor McCall saying that, and those bumper stickers being, you know, here in the future. I've always looked at it as Tom McCall also said some very eloquent things about what it meant to be an Oregonian, and taking our role as Oregonians really seriously. And so I've always felt like really what he was saying is you have to mean it to live here. You can't just come and change us to be what you were over there. You have to mean it. You have to believe in Oregon and what it means to be an Oregonian, and take stock in our state and keep it green, and all of the things that he had fought for, which he had fought very hard for, you know, the beach bill, the bottle bill. When he was a broadcaster in Portland, he famously did a television documentary on the pollution in the Willamette River. And it was that work that really galvanized Oregonians to take measures to help clean up the state and give us our green status and the Keep It Green motto.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't realize until you were doing your talk earlier about when you were referencing Tom McCall and his land use bill that was passed when he was the governor. You know, what an environmentalist he was, and you know, thinking about it was protecting the farms and protecting agriculture, but that the impact that land use law still has on us today, that we see exercised through, you know, not a whole lot of buildable land within the urban growth boundary, and you know what that has done to shape our physical geography.
Yes. Yeah, he had a huge footprint on this state. You know, more so, he's probably had the largest footprint on our state than any of the governors. And I think it's always important to me to put out there where he grew up. What, you know, our region is what informed a lot of his decisions. Having a connection to the land, having that connection to a ranch, was everything for him. And so it's one of those ways where politics has changed so dramatically that you had a Republican governor who was 100% about the environment, the science behind it, how do we protect it, and merging the environment and agriculture as an economy and something that was very, very important. Farms and farming and continuing that way of life was 100% behind Tom McCall and the land use system that now, you know, boy, there's folks that's their least favorite thing about us as a state,
Yeah.
you know, is our land use system. And so it's I always encourage people who, you know, could swear a blue streak because of our land use laws, you know, to look at the history of it, see it through time, you know, to understand it and have an appreciation for it before they move forward on, you know, how do we make it better? And it has been revamped over time. And what is applicable to us on the east side of the state, is it the same as the Willamette Valley, where you have a totally different agricultural community and economy still? You know, so it has been adjusted over time. It's faced a couple recalls, but it always holds for us, and we'd be a different state without it, without a question.
Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed your presentation, Kelly, because it just reminded me so much of my youth, the malls, the mall culture. When you were flipping through the bulletin stories, I'd see advertisements for businesses that, you know, aren't here anymore, but that I remember, you know, very distinctly.
Oh, I know. It was so hard. It was so hard to not just, yeah, it was so hard to not just build a PowerPoint around ads just for the movies that were playing, and with the loss of, that we're going to lose our Pennies store. So our Pennies opened downtown Bend in 1919, which one of our fellow library staff pointed out. So you're telling me that JCPenney's opened in Bend during a flu pandemic and is now going to close during the COVID pandemic? And I said, yes, it's bookended by pandemics. But you know, so here's all these fantastic JCPenney ads, you know, in the 70s newspapers for, you know, I just wanted out of that. The thing that I laughed at was that I almost put it in the talk but didn't, was, do you remember when the red ball stickers was the fire department's campaign for, you would put a red ball sticker on the bedroom windows where there were children, so that if the fire department showed up and your house was in flames, they would know which rooms to go for the kids?
I do remember that. I don't think my
Yeah,
parents bothered, but I do remember that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that my house, that we had the red ball either, but I totally remember it at school, and there was a big newspaper article about it, and it was, that almost made the cut. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I really want to thank you, and just want to let all the viewers know that we'll be taking next month off. July, we will not be doing a presentation about the decades, but we will be back in August, and we're going to start combining. So in August, we're going to look at the 90s and the 2000s. And I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of, now it's really going to start feeling familiar. So thanks, Kelly.
Yes. You're welcome.